So uh, we'll start in just a bit while we wait for the numbers to stabilize, and it seems like more people are coming in.
That's a lot of people, y'all. Wow.
I tried to warn you.
You did. It's exciting.
Yeah, so we're up to 700 now. Okay, we'll start. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Urge's fifth session entitled Racism and Accessibility. I begin today by paraphrasing Vernon Morris, our first speaker in the Urge series, who compared mass incarceration and police brutality to the historical exclusion of minoritized individuals in geoscience. He writes, in place of mass incarceration, there is mass exclusion in geoscience. In place of police brutality, geoscience careers are killed through forced attrition and underinvestment. Indeed, our task today is to understand why and later design policies that limit the effects of structural and institutional racism on the exclusion of people of color from geosciences. Today's guest interviewer and speakers are white. This panel is what many of the admissions and hiring committees look like. There should be more people of color in those rooms, especially women of color. Until that happens, I have a few questions for us now. Do we need to wait until there are more people of color in the room to ensure that our hiring practices and admission practices are actively anti-racist? Do we need to wait for the people of color in the room to speak out against these biases during admissions and hiring? Is it the job of the people of color in the room to dismantle a system that they did not build or benefit from? My answer to that is no. So I want to particularly encourage white people in all white spaces to continue or start doing bold anti-racist work. Because you benefit the most from racism, you have the most power, and you can, alongside your people of color colleagues, make a change in your institutions. I'm happy that so many people are on this journey with us in session 5. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bill, our interviewer and moderator for tonight.
Well, thank you, Vashan. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the 5th session of Urge. My name is Phil Duffy. I'm the President and Executive Director of Woodwell Climate Research Center. You may know us by our former name, Woods Hole Research Center. As I said, I appreciate the opportunity to moderate this session. I appreciate all of you taking the time to join us and listen to these two really exciting speakers. The topic today is improving the recruitment, hiring, and retention of inclusive and diverse university faculty. We will hear from two speakers today, Dr. Julie Posselt and Dr. Travis York. And I'm going to introduce both of those shortly. Before I do that, though, I want to offer a land acknowledgement statement. And that's always a little different when we're not in a room together. I don't know where all of you are. I'm speaking to you from Oakland, California, which is the traditional and sacred land of the Ohlone people who still occupy this land and whose history, language, traditional ways of life, and culture continue to influence this vibrant community. Also, before I introduce our first speaker, Dr. Julie Posselt, I want to just say if you have questions during the presentations, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will get to as many of those questions as we have time for. So again, our first speaker is Dr. Julie Posselt, who will discuss her work on inside graduate studies, Merit Beyond the Mirror. Dr. Posselt is an associate professor of higher education at USC at the Rache School of Education. She was a 2015-2017 National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation postdoctoral research fellow. Her research examines institutionalized inequities in higher education and organizational efforts aimed at reducing those inequities and encouraging diversity. She focuses particularly on selective sectors of higher education, graduate education, STEM fields, and elite undergraduate institutions where longstanding practices are being negotiated to better identify talent and educate students in a changing society. So again, she is going to discuss her work on inside graduate studies, Merit Beyond the Mirror. And thanks so much for joining us today.
Great, thank you, Phil. Well, hello, everybody. This is definitely the biggest Zoom group I've ever spoken to today, and I'm really looking forward to having a chance to have some discussion with you all about it, whether it's via the Q&A, our open discussion period, or afterward. So the chapter that you all read is from my first book, Inside Graduate Admissions, which I wrote to help unpack a very fundamental contradiction in American higher education, namely between the definitions of merit that guide the way that we select people for critical opportunities like admissions and hiring, and the espoused commitments that are increasingly widespread to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, as the population diversifies, so is our college student population. And the labor market for which students are seeking graduate degrees has also changed. But the systems we have for selecting and hiring professionals, which in many cases are not ones that we actually created, but rather were handed down to us, they have stacked the deck. They've stacked it in favor of groups that are already well represented, already influential, while disproportionately excluding Black and Brown applicants. I'm really excited to be able to speak with URGE because you are one of the few spaces in science that is having an open conversation about racism. And what happens in admissions and hiring are a textbook example of institutionalized racism. Specifically, we institutionalize or lock in racial inequalities as the normal state of affairs through our processes for identifying talent. And as I'm going to talk about, professors do so for a variety of reasons that are really deeply related to their own identities as scholars and the socialization that we typically get in grad school. So with the quick 10 minutes that I have to speak, I'm going to share some high-level findings from the work and propose a few specific practices that I hope can help begin to resolve some of these contradictions and reduce barriers in our current systems. Now, I got into this research because empirical research suggested a really basic tension between the professions of diversity in admissions on our websites and in our mission statements, and the evidence from published research that 2 of the 3 strongest predictors of who gets to go to graduate school are high GRE scores and having gone to a highly selective undergraduate institution. And this is a problem because who is earning very high GRE scores and who disproportionately has access to elite institutions are predominantly white and male. Further, there's strong evidence using audit studies of unconscious bias in responses to emails from prospective students, or at least that's how it's proposed in the work, is unconscious bias. Another way of interpreting it is institutionalized racism. And this is increasingly common as the legal precedent for affirmative action is getting more and more tight for institutions. Increasingly, what would be encouraged to us from a legal standpoint is a colorblind approach, so to speak. However, colorblind approaches tend to obscure attention to the very consequences that follow from our basic definitions of merit. So we can have what look like a neutral definition of what is excellence and have it ultimately undermine our diversity goals, in part because of access to how we've constructed it. So this is part of the way that I look at it, is that we've locked in inequality through our ongoing reliance on criteria that have disparate impact. But what I've tried to do is to draw out the common mental pathways that faculty hold, that they have inherited and that they use to legitimize the current system. And I use those mental pathways as starting points for a reconstruction of how we think about merit. And my work today is fundamentally working with faculty around the country, including within AGU, to begin reconstructing how it is that we are selecting students for grad school, how we select students for postdocs, and then how we select postdocs for faculty jobs. And what I want to argue is that the inequalities that we have today, they are neither inevitable nor natural. Rather, they are the result of a process that was socially constructed, that we have inherited, and that we have some decisions about what we want to do about, whether we're going to pass it on to the next generation or whether we're going to be actively involved in reconstructing it so as to deinstitutionalize racial hierarchy as the result of our selection processes. So the research that I did that became the basis for Inside Graduate Admissions was 2 years of fieldwork. And from my methodological world in cultural sociology, we would call it a comparative ethnographic case study, which basically means embedding myself within departments and observing them as much as they would allow, interviewing as many people who would allow. And I was able to interview 85 professors and a few grad students, as well as observe 6 of those departments' admissions committee meetings. So 10 programs, 3 universities, 22 hours of admissions committee meetings, which, as you can imagine, was fascinating. And there are 5 main findings that emerged from my work about this tension between how we define merit and the extent to which we value or not diversity. And the first is that I found a strong preference for certain criteria, was rooted in beliefs about what those criteria signal. And because the beliefs about those criteria like grades and GRE scores were tightly linked to their own identities as scholars in highly ranked programs, it was much harder for them to let go of them than if they were not personally invested in those criteria and what they mean. The second major pattern was that there's a strong preference for a process that is as efficient as possible and as collegial as possible. They're trying to get the job done quickly, and they're trying to do it with as little argument as possible. And this means that they step out of conversations when they need to. It means that they leave behind discussions of racist comments that come up in other kind of coded language. I also found that in fields that are high consensus, which are fields like economics, physics, and philosophy, which are sort of centralized and hierarchical, that there's a real strong tendency to defend their justifications to one another using what I call disciplinary logics, some sort of shared norms that they hold about methods, theories, metaphors, and practical priorities. And that when they don't have this, such as in fields like the geosciences, where you might have people from different disciplinary backgrounds working together, that there's a very strong role for individual preferences, including 4 patterns of what we call in sociology homophily, which is preference for people who are like yourself. And the 4 patterns of homophily that I found, which I'd be glad to talk about in the Q&A, have to do with pedigree, where having you come from an elite institution, you have a preference for people who are from elite institutions. A pattern of social mobility homophily, where there were at least a couple of people on each committee who had come from relatively modest backgrounds and were trying to pay forward the opportunities that they felt someone had once given them. International faculty are trying to keep international students on the radar as what counts for diversity. And then there was a very unexpected pattern around coolness, where faculty who were trying to present as cool would implicitly value applicants who themselves were trying to present as cool. But all of this would be insufficient if I didn't also acknowledge the very strong evidence in my data that faculty are ambivalent about change, and especially about changes that are related to equity and diversity, specifically because it forces them to confront the fact that they are not as anti-racist as they think, that they are not as enlightened with respect to sexism as they think. And faculty, especially within STEM disciplines, are often not prepared to have those conversations, which is part of why URGE is so important. So what I want to share with the few minutes that I have is just a little bit in my data about why it is that faculty rely so much on GRE scores, knowing, in fact, in many cases that they undermine opportunities. And what I found is that when I asked everyone straight up in my interviews, what do you think GRE scores signal? More than half of them volunteered something about intelligence, using language like native intelligence or sheer intellectual horsepower. And then here it was really good for me to be observing meetings, because more than half of the time that the GRE came up in admissions committee meetings, it was as part of a thought or a sentence or some sort of conversation that I came to classify as smart talk in my data. So smart talk consists in comments like, I question she has what it takes, or wow, that guy's a freaking genius. These sort of offhanded comments that betray the way that they're really thinking about what this means. And a big part of this is that they associate intelligence with risk and who they believe belongs in the academy. In fact, this idea about risk aversion was one of the most prominent findings in my data. And those of you who are faculty may appreciate on some level that you want to approach admissions as from a posture of risk aversion and an investment, because we want to make sure that the students are not going to just survive the coursework, but be successful in their careers and degrees. Now, in the programs that I studied, which were pretty highly ranked, 3 of them also volunteered to me that they thought of risk aversion as a sort of luxury. And sometimes this intersected with equity considerations, and that's really where the rub is it's no secret that few women and Black and Latino students are earning very high GRE scores. Some participants recognized, however, that they might need to admit students with different preparation than usual in order to admit as many women and students of color as they wanted. But I also observed a variety of instances where faculty challenged the script that associated scores with intelligence, ability, and risk. For example, in philosophy, there was a counter script that I described, where they would recognize that a low GRE score or going to a less selective institution could be associated with gender and not have nothing to do with their future as a scholar. And so I argue that if we're going to reconstruct what counts as merit, being prepared with counter scripts, kind of knowing what some of the standard tropes and narratives are that people use to justify the system is important, because we need to be able to counter those misperceptions. Now, I could tell you much more about the data, about the variety of misperceptions that are out there, and I'd be glad to do that when we have time. But I want to make sure I'm leaving some time to talk specifically about some recommended practices. And I say recommended practices because I don't necessarily believe in the concept of best practices. I believe that what is best for you in your department is probably going to be a little bit different than what is best in the USC School of Education. And that what is best in 2020 and 2021 is probably different than what might be best in 2025, because the conditions of the society in which people are trying to gain access to grad school are different. And we have to be mindful of context before we can define what's best. But some specific strategies for equity in graduate admissions that are not necessarily reliant upon context so much include an annual, or at least every other year, revisiting of what your typical admissions routines are and making them explicit. Because so much of what hides behind the wall of the way that we do things is just the fact that we don't talk about it, which is again part of why URGE and having an open conversation about the various manifestations of racism is so critical. I also recommend, as part of making your admissions routines explicit, that you engage in rubric-based admissions evaluation. Now, there's nothing magic about rubrics, but what they do, and why they have been demonstrated over and over to reduce racial biases in evaluations, is they focus our attention on the things that we should be paying attention to, as opposed to the various things that are gut, that are emotions, that all of those things that we're socialized to believe would allow us to be thinking about in moments where we're supposed to be using as much discretion as possible. I also recommend not using GRE scores, in part because they are not necessary in most cases to predict who's going to be successful, because they undermine opportunities and because they pose a financial barrier for many students. I also encourage departments to consider the efficacy of their committee, thinking about who's on the committee and recognizing there is that tendency for homophily, for people to value people who are like themselves, but also normalizing the ability to disagree with your colleagues so that you can check people's misperceptions along the way. As for this idea about checking, another critical step is doing equity checks. And equity checks are simply knowing what the composition is of your applicant pool, and then occasionally through the process, taking a step back to see if you are at least preserving those proportions, if not trying to increase the proportion from underrepresented groups. One way that you might be able to do this is by getting some data from your graduate school. And most graduate schools stand ready to provide support to departments that want to do more with respect to equity and admissions. Finally, I'll leave you with a recommendation around recruitment. A lot of departments don't necessarily see it as their responsibility to do recruitment. But that flawed view became so prominent in my data when I was studying admissions that I ended up writing a whole second book about how important it is to engage a conversation about admissions, recruitment, mentoring, and climate at the same time, because these are interrelated as practices. This is a part of a broader need that we have within the community, to be able to think about equity from multiple angles and to approach any one given area of practice as part of a broader system of practices that all need reconstructing. It's not just admissions. So I'll leave it there for now and turn it over to Travis, or back to Phil, I guess.
Yeah, thanks so much, Julie. That was really thoughtful, really interesting. I can see you just in 10 or 12 minutes just barely scratched the surface of a whole lot of interesting insight. So let me turn now to our next speaker, who is Dr. Travis York. He's the Director of Inclusive STEM Ecosystems for Equity and Diversity at the American Association for Advancement of Science, AAAS. Dr. York's research focuses on catalyzing and sustaining systemic change and transformation to achieve inclusive and equitable access and progress through STEM pathways into the STEM workforce. Dr. York is a co-PI on the NSF Includes Aspire Alliance, which is an effort to develop a more inclusive and diversified STEM faculty. Dr. York is going to talk to us today about leveraging promising practices, improving the recruitment, hiring, and retention of inclusive and diverse faculty. So thanks so much for joining us, Dr. York. I look forward to your remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. And I just have to say thank you to the whole URGE team, and thank you to my co-interviewee, Julie Passolt. Julie's work is just incredible and such a value to the community. And thank you to the URGE team for letting me get a chance to join you all today and to share some time with you. I'm excited to share kind of some of the work that myself and several colleagues have been doing together, and really excited to join this conversation with the geoscience field. And as Julie said, she said it so wonderfully multiple times that it's just so exciting to see a group of people having such an intentional conversation. And that's really what we need to do to move us into the space where we can deconstruct systems that we have either inherited or have perhaps reified ourselves unknowingly or knowingly at times, that aren't really serving us in our true needs. And I start there today in describing the article we shared. I do want to give just credit for a second. The work that I'm talking about tonight is work that I have not done by myself. In fact, I have incredible colleagues I can't not miss a chance to brag a little bit about. So Kimberly Ann Griffin, who's a faculty member at University of Maryland, is a wonderful colleague of mine, and Dr. Jessica Bennett, who's at the Association for Public and Land Grant Universities. We've done so much of this work together through our NSF-funded programs. And a lot of what I'm sharing with you today is really comes from a body of work that Kimberly has been doing. And so I just want to make sure I'm giving proper credit to those incredible scholars themselves. So today, part of what I'm going to be sharing about is a little bit more of the kind of some strategies around how institutions and how departments and how programs can take a structural approach to some of this change. And as Julie nicely pointed out, we do kind of see very clear trends, right, in the data around the issues of lack of representation, and especially as we think about scholars transitioning through STEM pathways, through talent development and into research careers or academic careers, we just continue to see a disproportionate drop in representation. And what's been interesting to me is over the past 15 to 20 years that I've been engaging in this work, there always has seemed to me to be really three primary ways that this conversation has been held around diversifying faculty. And usually the first, or one of the first conversations, is really built around this idea that it's a pipeline problem, and that the number of people from underrepresented groups are simply receiving too many or too few STEM PhDs, and so the pool is too small. The other conversation that we hear oftentimes is that it's a hiring problem, that due to implicit bias or lack of effort and commitment, that structural racism keeps institutions from hiring faculty that are more diverse, from more diverse backgrounds. And then the third part of this conversation that I hear a lot, especially from institutional leaders, is that this is a retention problem. That while they might be able to hire faculty that are diverse, from diverse backgrounds, that these faculty are more likely to either exit the institution or not to get tenure and to leave the professoriate. Of course, these are all in some degrees to more or less myths, in fact. Right, the pool of candidates has been increasing across all STEM disciplines, across all underrepresented groups. And the reality is that the transition of that talent into, even at this assistant professors, where we see the greatest amount of diversity, is just disproportional. And so it's not just a pool issue. We can always do more to increase the pipeline. And so much of what Julie just talked about is how we can really think about our pathways into STEM and questioning some of those discretionary spaces and broaden those, restructure those. But really, this conversation, I think the reason, part of what we need to do is the ways that we've been having, or that institutional leaders in particular have been having this conversation, really limits the ways that we then might approach solutions to this very complex problem. And so what we've been trying to do, my colleagues and I, is really kind of rethink what is this issue? How do we educate STEM leaders, institutional leaders, department chairs about the complexities of this problem? And how do we offer solutions that are perhaps aimed at systemic change in a different way? And so first part of that is not thinking about these as three distinct issues. It's not a pathways pool issue, a hiring issue, and a retention issue, but in fact that these issues are all interrelated, and in fact deeply so interrelated. And then the second part of that is that we, in addition to thinking about these issues as being related, we really try in our work to think about this as in a systems approach. In social science, we take what we call an ecological approach, which is a appropriated scientific term, right? And what we mean by that is we really try to think about the systems in play and the structures that, as Julie so nicely pointed out, many people might have inherited, and that without questioning, they are based on values. So values that may or may not align with the values that we hold today, but they do in fact either limit or in fact push people out of the academy, in particular Black and brown people, in particular women. And so, and many others, persons with disabilities, sexual minoritized populations, and veterans as well. And so the bulk of our work has been in particular on racial minorities and women, and the intersectionalities of those two identities, in particular because of the availability of data in this space. But I do want to kind of point out that the practices that I'm going to talk about, the strategies today, help all people. If we make our systems and our processes more inclusive, they will work better for all people. And so there is a real intentionality around this approach. And so the article that we shared with you, part of the way that we're trying to do this education is by giving a fuller picture. So we present a model for for increasing faculty diversity. And that model is it offers a more complex, multidimensional framework that helps institutions understand the factors and forces that impact their ability to recruit, hire, and retain faculty from diverse backgrounds. Part of that reframing of this conversation then is to think about these three kind of categories of recruitment, transition, and retention as related aspects of the same system. And so thinking about them in tandem helps institutions really kind of look at their whole process and really find the spaces where they're not serving faculty or faculty candidates well. The other thing that I want to point out here is that there is no silver bullet. I feel like I should have I should have paid Julie some money because she did some really heavy lifting in her conversation on some complex ideas that make my job much easier going second here. So thank you, Julie. But Julie talked about not really buying into best practices, and I couldn't have said that better. I don't think there really are best practices for diversifying your faculty. In fact, what we have actually found in the literature is that all strategies that we have concertedly looked at across multiple institutions have mixed evidence. There's strategies that work at some institutions and the same strategies that don't work at other institutions. And I would actually argue, and I have argued in some recent research, that this is actually, I believe, because of a fundamental change trap that institutional leaders fall into. And that's when they become aware of a problem, they oftentimes jump to implementing a best practice or a strategy without fully understanding the real root causes that are showing up in their awareness of a problem. And so in our work with institutions and institutional leaders, we really work to equip institutional leaders to understand the deeper issues that they and their institution are struggling with, and really understanding the complex barriers that they're presenting to candidates, faculty candidates, and to their faculty, their existing faculty, so that they can really choose strategies that can support those faculty, or really rethink about the systems that they have in place and where those systems are not actually doing what they think those systems are supposed to do. So this change trap of really focusing, kind of jumping, we see a problem and we're just going to jump into a solution, I think is part of what has created the mix of evidence that we actually see around strategies, and why there isn't much literature to suggest you should do these things. It's because of really misimplementation that we get those results. And this has been seen by other researchers as well. A really incredible bulk of research recently done by Sandra Larson and Ann Austin on NSF advanced funding institutions found something very similar in their work of studying 19 advanced institutions. This work came out in 2014. They found that there are no best practices for increasing gender equity across in faculty across campuses. That similarly, the context absolutely matters. So what do we do here? Well, this is where I kind of advocate for multifaceted solutions. And really, I think about this in multiple frames. So the ways that institutions can create a multifaceted solution that actually helps them move forward in this space is to think about frames for deep change. And so I borrow a framework that has been used by WePan, a great group that does a lot of diversification work in engineering in particular. And that's what we draw upon in the article that we shared with you in thinking about the 4 frames: equipping the individual, creating equal opportunities, valuing difference, and managing culture. And the reason that we think about these 4 frames is that we argue and we encourage institutional leaders to think about a set of strategies that actually cover all 4 frames. And that is actually really important to think about how you're trying to address issues of inequality in your system, to think about the processes and the structures that you're putting in place across these 4 frames. So oftentimes what we see is institutional leaders might employ a strategy of a program that might really be directed towards an individual, helping an individual navigate a system better. And while this can be very helpful, while many of these programs are actually fantastic programs that really support a variety of folks, in a way, that's also saying that the problem is those people, that it's the people's problem, that the people's fault that they can't navigate the system they're in or can't move through the system, right? That the system's not the problem. And the reality is that the system is also the problem. And so thinking more in this kind of complexity, multifaceted process, it allows us to both support people and really think about the systems that we have in place. And oftentimes when we see a program that is really helping people through a STEM pathway or in a process, that's also a good indicator that there's probably a stopgap occurring with that program. So what is it where is the system failing that requires a certain group of people to be helped by a program, especially if it's a targeted program? To me, that's always actually a red flag. It doesn't mean that that program isn't good. I'll use mentoring for an example here. All faculty, new faculty in particular, benefit from mentoring, especially when mentoring is implemented well, when faculty mentors are trained. There's a whole bunch of caveats I would throw in here, right? But we also see it disproportionately benefiting faculty from historically underserved populations, women faculty, minority faculty, first generation faculty. And that is a flag to me that there's something about the system that is not giving all faculty the things they need to be successful in their role. And that's why there's a disproportional effect here for other faculty. Again, doesn't mean that mentoring is bad. In fact, mentoring is fantastic and a great thing that all faculty should get. But we should use that opportunity to question why there's a disproportional effect and why the system, what in the system is, what it is about the system that is making some groups not get what they need in other ways, in the system's kind of designed way, if that makes sense. I'm happy to talk more about this in questions as well. So I did want to give a couple examples of that as I'm running out of time here, because I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. But you saw in the article, or if you haven't had a chance to read it, please check it out. You saw in the article that in we think about these frames, there are still the kind of frame one is about equipping the individual. And that's really about kind of rethinking the recruitment process as a long-term process, about building relationships with faculty and ushering them into positions. So I think we have to rethink some of the myths that we have around hiring faculty from our own student body or from postdocs in particular, rethinking about how we're growing our own talent, the use of mentoring and peer networks. We talk about democratizing knowledge and processes so that what is unwritten should no longer be unwritten, but in fact should be really standardized and transparent. In frame two, we then talk about creating equal opportunities and really thinking about how we prioritize the value of diversity and inclusion. Is that written into job descriptions? Is there a statement of contributions to diversity requested from all faculty? So a lot of great work starting to happen where institutions are looking at that strategy as a way to have a system check in their faculty hiring process. Our third frame and fourth frame get, I think, a little bit more difficult for us to talk about because they're not really initiative based. They then really we really start to talk about valuing. So our third frame is about valuing difference and thinking about ways in which institutions, programs, and departments really espouse a value of valuing difference. So what does it mean to create cultural artifacts that demonstrate the values that you espouse? What does it mean to rethink how you provide awards, what awards you give, how awards are chosen or doled out, what recognition really looks like, and how are faculty receiving that recognition? And even the stories that become kind of narratives that guide our value system in our institutions. These are all really important things for us to rethink and to do some deep self-assessment in our institutions. And then finally, that leads us to our fourth frame around managing culture. And this is a really interesting frame, I think, especially for the URGE community to think about, because in this frame, we talk about how important it is to question the roots of objective or neutral criteria, both internally and externally. And I think in particular, in STEM disciplines and fields, we have work to do around really parsing our understanding or critically kind of assessing what cultural norms around science really mean. How do we think of success or competition in the field of geoscience? And is that culturally new, or is that value neutral? And how is that tied or not tied to ideas of who should be faculty, how faculty should be praised, how faculty's careers should be lauded even by external organizations? My own is even an example of this. In AAAS, we think a lot about the fact that we have a lot of what we call career building opportunities as an association through giving awards, fellowships, recognition, story, face time. And what responsibility do we have as an association in thinking about the criteria that go into that, the ways that how neutral or objective is the process that recognition occurs, and what do we culturally transmit across STEM at large as what being a good faculty is, or being an excellent researcher is. So this responsibility is not just with faculty, it's not just with department chairs, deans, provosts, or presidents. It really is a systemic approach that we have to take as a field of scholars and researchers across education and education adjacent spaces, national labs, associations, accrediting bodies. It really will take a full-scale effort. And as Vashon said when he first started this work, I'm very happy to say that it is also the responsibility of all persons in this process to do this work. And so thank you for letting me be a part of it with you. And I'm going to turn it back so that we can dive into some more questions.
Great, Travis. Thanks so much. That was really, really interesting and helpful. So we have some questions, which I can get to. We also have two inclusivity tips, which are coming in the form of short videos. And the first is from Abigail Swan, called Navigating My Department. If we're ready to play that, we can play that now. If we're not ready to play that, I will put forth a question. It looks like we're ready to play that.
Hi, my name is Abigail Swan, and I'm going to talk today about some work we've been doing at the University of Washington in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences to make our graduate admissions process more holistic. We acknowledge that there is much work to do across many facets of our department as well as our discipline. Graduate recruitment is only one aspect, but it's a major gate through which we all pass, and it's what I've been asked to talk about today. We've been working on changing our process for about the last 4 years, and we expect that we'll continue to adapt it over time. So how did we come to this process? Well, our graduate school offered a training on creating a more holistic admissions process, and members of our department's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee attended the workshop and brought back recommendations, which we followed. Our goals were to create a process where we had more useful information to assess the potential for success of applicants in our program that didn't rely on metrics that we know are not accessible to everyone. And this is really hard, and we're continuing to work on figuring out how to meet that goal. We felt that the personal statement prompt is particularly a place where students are not given very much guidance for what is expected, which favors students who don't have access to mentorship. Additionally, much of what students write is not actually that useful for helping us make decisions about admissions. So we thought the prompt could be a lot more explicit in guiding students to give us the information that we actually want to know about to assess their potential for our program. We decided to start by figuring out what characteristics make our students successful so that we could specifically ask questions which prompt students to tell us about those things. So as a committee, we also wanted to get departmental buy-in to both to change the process and for what those specific characteristics were that we wanted to assess. So the department's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, or EDI committee, organized a departmental workshop for students, postdocs, faculty, and staff, where we asked small groups to brainstorm the key characteristics that make students successful in our program, and then we shared across groups to find common themes. Using those common characteristics that emerged from the workshop, we created a more specific personal statement prompt, as well as a rubric to evaluate the whole application. We then shared the draft of that with the department and revised it following comments. When then we used that in our next application cycle, we assigned every faculty member a set of applications to review and score using the paired rubric. Additionally, any candidates that could be identified as contributing to diversity in some way, flagged by reviewers or self-identified, were given additional review by faculty on the EDI committee to carefully consider how to match the opportunities we have in the department with those applicants. After going through this process, the EDI committee proposed to the faculty to drop the GRE as a requirement for applications. It was generally popular but not unanimously supported and took some conversation over time. Eventually, we dropped the GRE with near unanimous approval, and we redact those scores if students report them. The numbers are small, so it's hard to know if our changes have really made a significant difference at this point, but we have been successful in the past few years at recruiting students who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color to our program. And we plan to track the success both of our admissions process in terms of recruiting these students, but also their success in our program and beyond as part of our department's EDI plan. So what are some of the remaining issues? Well, we really like that our essay prompt gives a much more explicit information about what we expect students to tell us. However, only about half of applicants actually follow the directions and answer our questions. So it's hard to evaluate the applications where some people followed the directions and some haven't. So we're looking for ways to make it more obvious that students should answer our specific questions. We still need to work on aligning our process with our rubric and making sure that the rubric gets used in a consistent manner. So some ideas that we have about how to do that are reducing down the number of faculty doing the initial reading of applications so that we can make sure that they're really well versed and trained in how to use that rubric. And other application materials remain biased, and opportunities are not equally accessible to all applicants. So how do we deal with this? One particular one that we worry about is that we do strongly favor students who've had at least some research experience in a STEM field because our program is very research intensive, but not all students have had access to undergraduate research opportunities. So we welcome more ideas on this. One that we've come up with is that we're looking into starting an RU type summer internship program where we can help provide more of those research opportunities to the community. I feel strongly that the specific admissions prompt is giving better guidance to students, and when it's done well, is more useful information for us for evaluating applications. However, I do realize that we're asking students to do more work to write something specifically for our department. Personally, I would love to see this type of specific prompt requested by all schools across the geosciences. Perhaps this is something we could consider as across the network of groups that are assembled here. Or perhaps consider even more drastic changes, such as a central application through which students can be matched to programs more like a medical residency. I'm really excited to hear about what different pods will come up with in terms of suggested solutions to issues associated with equity in graduate admissions. And I thank you all for listening.
My name is Karen Block, and I'm an associate professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the City College of New York and the City University of New York. Thank you to the URGE team for inviting me to record this inclusivity tip on letters of recommendation. As we know, letters of recommendation are a form of gatekeeping that can often trigger bias on the part of the people receiving those letters. And so over the years, I've thought a lot about the letters that I have read that have stayed with me for both good and bad reasons. In a nutshell, the way that I craft my letters are so that the reader understands that it would be their privilege to recruit an extraordinary candidate. So I tried to be really careful not to use a deficit model that talks about the candidate's deficiencies, and instead I try to talk about all the positive things without shying away from superlatives. So if the student is especially good at coding, or they are very good at in their technical skills or in their writing skills, if they're very curious or creative, those are the things that I really like to focus on in my letters. I would say that if you are not sure that the language that you're using could potentially be hedging or potentially introducing bias, that there are resources out there, such as a sheet on avoiding gender and racial bias crafted by Dr. Esmera Asafal-Berhe and Dr. Sora Kim at UC Merced, and also the article in Nature Geosciences by Kuheli Dut on gender biases. When crafting letters of recommendation, it's really important to also not highlight where the student might be disadvantaged. In my institution, about 60% of students at City College are low income, possibly more. There's also a very large population of students who are first generation or come from minoritized communities. And so I try to stay away from pointing out that students belong to those groups unless the opportunity calls specifically for recruiting from those groups. In the cases where some students work 20 to 40 hours a week, in which that may impact the student's GPA, I try to mention that only in the sense that it's a superpower, that a student can accomplish so much despite the fact that they have such extreme pressures with regard to work. I also want to mention that because I am Boricua from Puerto Rico, and I work at a Hispanic serving institution, a minority serving institution, that students sometimes seek me out to write letters for them, even if they have not worked in my laboratory or been in one of my courses. And so there are times when I have to say no. I would rather say no to a student than write a weak letter. In the cases where students may not have a lot of experience under their belt, then I might ask them for what my colleague calls a brag sheet, so that I can speak to their accomplishments and I can give information on what makes them competitive for a particular opportunity. Some final thoughts that I have on letters. I would say consider sharing the letter with the candidate. Some of our students have really deep-seated imposter syndrome. And so hearing somebody else speak very positively about their accomplishments can really give them a confidence boost. Lastly, as my parting thought, I would say that I measure my success by the accomplishments of my students and my mentees. And so therefore, I think that is my biggest professional source of pride, to be able to boost them and to help them get ahead in this career. And so that, in effect, will be my most lasting legacy. Thanks.
So I thought that was a really wonderful thought to close on, of measuring success by the accomplishments of our students and mentees. I love that sentiment. So it's 3:25 and we haven't had a chance to dig into any questions. So while the video was playing, the panelists agreed among themselves that we would extend the session for 10 additional minutes, so 15 minutes total from now. So just so we have time to get to some of those questions, I'm going to start with a couple of questions for Dr. Passelt, and one is very short, and that is this: it might be my misperception that discussion of race and gender are not allowed in the selection process. Are there legal restrictions on the discussion of gender or race?
Yeah, I'm really glad that somebody asked this, because it's a common misperception that we should somehow be averse to all discussion of race and gender just because the Supreme Court has set limits on what's considered constitutional to weigh as a factor. But it's a really big difference to give a person an advantage in an evaluation process because of their social identity than it is to consider, for example, what they bring as a result of their identities that is also beneficial to your organization. Another way that you can definitely talk about race and gender within selection processes, regardless of what your current legal context is the awareness that the backgrounds that people are bringing are going to be different systematically based on access to opportunities that are raced, that are gendered, that are classed in America. And so whether you're in one of the 42 states where the Supreme Court's precedent is what guides you, or whether you're in one of the states where there's been a state-based sort of mandate against affirmative action in hiring, admissions, and financial aid awards, You can definitely talk about race in those ways. Committees do not need to be thinking of themselves as color mute.
If I could
Great.
add
Thank
to
you.
that as well. Oh, sorry, Phil, I was just going to add quickly to that as
Sure.
well. There's also a slate of race neutral strategies that that are available for institutions or institutional leaders to think about as well. That can be really powerful ways to think about the equity checks that Julie had mentioned beforehand, that where you can increase the inclusion of your processes to make them more race conscious. I'm sorry, more productive while still being race neutral.
So thank you. So here's a question which is of interest to me personally as someone who leads an organization that's not a university. And the question is, can the speakers talk about how their research does or does not apply to non-universities, entities like federal agencies or independent research organizations? How do these institutions differ, and how should recommended practices differ?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that I began studying this is I'm really curious about how it is that we define what's valuable. And anytime you're in a situation, whether it's deciding to put someone up for an award or who to hire, who to admit, you're basically making value-based judgments. And so the models for more equitable evaluation and selection that my team has been developing over time are anchored on the act of evaluation and selection much more than the context of this. And have spent a lot of work doing work on graduate admission specifically, but being able to think about disparate opportunities that people have had, being able to think about the value of diversity in your context, being able to know what does potential for success look like in your organization, and what is the mission of your organization that you could better align with equity and diversity so that you can begin to more consciously select for those things. None of those factors are institution or university specific. In fact, the more mindful a hiring committee, an award committee, a tenure committee is about those factors, the more likely they'll be to be fair in other more informal forms of evaluation as well.
Thank you. Travis, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, so we do our work outside of institutions as well. In fact, we have a program called Sea Change at AAAS, where we're purposely working with other professional societies to think about how they do their work, just similar to what I was mentioning in our own work at AAAS. The other thing that I would add here is, I think from a process standpoint, at the end of the day, the essential piece here is really looking at where discretionary spaces exist in a process. Where are the places where there are humans making decisions, especially without rubrics, as Julie mentioned, are so important. And how are they making those decisions? You can build a more equitable system fundamentally by doing one of two things, and hopefully both of these two things. You can either invest in people, you can build the capacity of individuals to act in more equitable spaces. You can give unconscious bias training, you can go give long-term multiple engagement processes to help people act more equitably. There's mixed results about whether or not we can actually control for implicit bias. Or you can make a system that's more equitable. And this is where equity checks or system checks are so important. Because where there's a discretionary space, where a decision is occurring, there should be a check on that decision to see if that decision is really espousing the values that you intend for it to espouse. And the key here,
Travis,
I think,
can I jump in and add something? Oh,
yes,
sorry,
please.
Go ahead. I thought you were done.
No, go for it, Julie.
Yeah, I was going to say the other thing that happens in the discretionary spaces is people are making meaning. And those are racialized moments often. A lot of the ways that we are socialized to make meaning in moments of discretion is conditioned by biases. And when I say we, I'm talking about fellow white people. And so especially for those who are participating who are white, being able to be conscious of those moments where your instinct is in play. And cognitive science and behavioral economists have documented the system 1 and the system 2 brain. and the likelihood that biases are more likely to come out when we're in the quick mode of decision making as opposed to being more thoughtful, more deliberate. So yeah, the equity checks are critical as part of a more systemic approach, but it is in those moments where you have discretion without accountability that we're most likely to see inequalities be reproduced.
Yeah, I completely agree with Julian. It's a really wonderful contribution there. I think an area where I'm really curious in this space is thinking about, are there ways that we can use discretionary spaces to make institutions more equitable? Is there, in fact, a way that we can capitalize on those opportunities in an intentional way to actually make our organizations, help our organizations value diversity and value equity more? So that's a really exciting way to think more in this space too.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very interesting thought. Okay, next question is a little longer. It has to do with, well, advice on appropriate materials for graduate admissions. And so I'll read the question. It says, my department has already removed the GRE from consideration in our admissions. That leaves grades, transcripts, research experience, letters of recommendation, student personal statements, and pre-decision conversations as the items we consider. Arguably, many of these also select for applicants from privileged backgrounds. Understanding that different faculty place greater or lesser emphasis on different applications items, which materials do you think are the most fair generally to applicants?
It's a good question. And wouldn't it be nice if there were an easy answer to it? The truth is that each individual part of an application, depending upon the mindset of who's reading it, can be used in various ways. And which is why it's so important to have letters of recommendation be written from a mindset of equity. It's so important to provide equal access to the kind of coaching that we're expecting for personal statements, or for departments that are moving from personal statements to short answer questions, which are less easy to game. Some graduate schools are starting to host training opportunities for people who want to apply to their graduate school, recognizing that some people don't get coaching. But still, it wouldn't be enough, because each of those individual pieces of an application is still only going to tell us one aspect of what a person is like. So one of the benefits of the approach to holistic review that my colleagues and I have developed is that it's not just comprehensive and that we're thinking across different parts of the application, but that it's equity minded from the core. And this is really like related to what Travis was saying, that you can use moments of decision making for equity. They're not just threatening. They're also real opportunities to move and assert priorities. The other two criteria for holistic review that we recommend are contextualized review. So instead of just looking at information at its face value, you look beneath the surface and you think, why is it that we see the disparities that we see? You understand that if a student didn't have a research opportunity in 2020, it might have nothing to do with their ability to be a great scientist. It was just a COVID issue. So being able to contextualize and relate information to each other instead of just treating them as discrete bits, I think motivates a need for the different parts of the application, as imperfect as those individual parts might be. And then lastly, we recommend being systemic about it, or systematic about it. And this is where rubrics can come in terms of telling each person what they should be looking at for and what excellence looks like at different levels, so that you don't just have individual judgments coloring their view of what it is that they see when they look at a letter of recommendation. So yeah, in all of this, individual parts of an application are not going to be equally fair, but we can be increasingly design them to be fair. And then how we look at them, how we make sense of them together can be made more fair.
Great answer. Let's see. Thank you. So thanks for that. So the next question, from your analysis, can you speak to what extent idealization of the academic path on the part of professors and faculty, what impact that has on their hesitance to abandon metrics like GRE scores? In other words, if faculty are more likely to believe that entering academia is better or preferred career choice, are they more likely to place value on pedigree or assessment metrics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. The way that we either formally or informally think of what a successful scholar looks like is critical to how we make sense of prospective scholars' records in front of us. which is why it's so important to have the data about what the distribution of career outcomes are for today's PhDs, so that we stop glorifying the R1 tenure track professor and recognize the great science that's being done across the country in different kinds of organizations. Now, that being said, there's an important part of this conversation where to know what that value is and then to negotiate it with your colleagues is sometimes a different matter than for each individual to come to some degree of persuasion about that, which is why the workshops that I lead for faculty in this area start with the question, how do you define success? Because once they can come to some agreement on that, then it becomes more logical to select for that. The last thing I'll say, though, is that it's really important to keep in mind that when we're selecting for success, that we're probably limited in our imagination based on our own socialization. And so being able to include diverse voices in the conversation about who's defining what is excellent, what is successful, is absolutely critical, so that we don't just reproduce a new version of people who are like ourselves.
Yeah. So we're running short on time, but I want to try to get in one more question, because I really want to hear the answer to this, and this is for Travis. And this is, whoops, the question disappeared. Well, I'll paraphrase the question. The question was, what advice do you have? Well, you mentioned that different solutions to improving equity and diversity, that there are no best practices, that if the effectiveness depends on institutional context, and that to understand or to choose a strategy that's going to work in your institution, you really need to understand what the underlying institutions are. Underlying challenges are within your institution. And the question is basically, okay, how do you reconcile that, which sounds like a time-consuming process, with the urgency of moving forward and the urgency of having showing demonstrable progress?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it is. Yeah, I don't think that institutional leaders jump into strategies hoping that, like, just trying to check I don't think they usually are doing that, just trying to check a box. I do think that some of that happens. I think it really is out of a desire to actually fix the problem. I think there is, on the whole, good intent here by higher education. I think the problem here is that for over 30, 40 years, institutions of higher education have been trying to diversify faculty. And in fact, federal agencies like NSF have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into efforts and into funded programs aimed at diversifying the STEM workforce, the whole STEM workforce. And that has not actually resulted in a demonstrably a difference at the national level around representation. And I think that is because most of those programs have really focused on individuals. And again, it's not to say that those programs that support individuals are not valuable, but they are a necessary and insufficient solution, in that we have to actually address the systems and the processes. And that takes a long-term commitment. There is no silver bullet. There is no one size fits all. There really is a long-term commitment to the hard and slow work of changing our systems and processes. And it doesn't have to be that slow. The good news here is I've been working with a set of institutions in our Aspire network, our institutional change or iChange network, that has over 54 universities trying to do this, trying right now to change their structures and the processes. And what we've learned in working with those countless universities, public and private, small and large, is that this work doesn't take a tremendous amount of fiscal resources. So that's the good news. This isn't about funding a new program to fund a whole bunch of people and do a lot of hires. This work is really about the hard work that takes time, takes individuals time to really question the assumptions that they have, question the value-laden processes that they use, really, as Julie said, contextualize their data. There was a great question in the chat asking about kind of where institutions should be looking. Like if they look at their faculty overall, they seem to have parity. And the person asking the question, I'm sorry, I didn't see who it was, but said, should I accept this? No, you shouldn't accept that, right? Because we need to get into the details. That's where the hidden figures are. And so we need to really look at the data in a contextualized way. We have to match the quantitative data with really important qualitative questions about why are we doing what we're doing, what our actual goals are. And this work has a long horizon. When we make changes around faculty policy, it takes 6 to 8 years before we see the impact of that data. But there are leading indicators that can tell us, are we starting to have an effect that's in the right direction? And so we can get that data narrative out. We can see kind of glimpses of, are we headed in the right direction? But it has to be a long-term commitment, really, to change.
Well, thanks so much. And we're past time. We were even past the extended time. A lot more questions we could have got to, a lot of interest. I want to just briefly, once again, thank our panelists, Dr. Julie Passelt, Dr. Travis York. Thanks so much for joining us. It's been a really, really interesting and provocative discussion. And I'll just turn the floor back over to Bashan Wright to close out the session. And thanks again for inviting me to moderate. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. And this one was hefty and we went a little bit over time. I thank everybody who stuck with us. I'll close by saying, I've been visiting pods and I've been observing the conversations and I've chimed in. I went to the UC San Diego Scripps Institution of Oceanography pod to talk about hiring and admissions this past week. And what I suggested was for everybody to take a look at their admissions and hiring policies, understand and identify areas where there are discretion happening, areas where you're making personal decisions, areas where people are by themselves, areas where there are conversations. Point out all of those areas in all of your hiring practices, identify them, add reminders of equity and equity checks at each of those locations, and design strategies for each of those locations to limit biases that could crop up. So you train the people, identify where there's discretion, put reminders of biases that could happen at those places, add action items at each of those places, and see what happens with your hiring process. I think that was suggested by Julie and Travis here, and I really like that idea. And I encourage people to look at their deliverables in that type of way. And the last thing I'll say, as Travis said, we need to look at the systems, we need to look at the policies and the structures. And that's why we created URGE. And that's why they're deliverables. And that's why we're saying build policies within the deliverables. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And remember, policy is our love language. See you in 2 weeks.